What is God like? We'll be looking at the attributes of God in this particular part one. In our next segment, will be kind of like looking in our next segment would be part two. The attributes will continue that. But in our previous segment, we showed you that God has revealed himself and made himself known. He is a very personal God and one you can know, pray to, trust in, and have confidence in. In this segment, we will introduce you to the attributes of God. The word attribute comes from the word tribute, which actually means to bestow, to give tribute to. And Webster defines an attribute specifically as an inherent characteristic. And note the word inherent, which means belonging to the basic nature of someone or something, involved in the constitution or essential character of something. Next, also, he says to regard as a characteristic of a person or thing, or something attributed as belonging, a quality, a character, characteristic, or a property of. Also, an object closely associated with or belonging to a specific person, thing, or office. And finally, a word ascribing a quality. So God's attributes are really his characteristics and his qualities. That which actually makes God, God. We have attributes too as individuals and as human beings, and we'll talk about that more. For example, what attributes or characteristics do you have? Well, you might say, I'm a faithful person. Well, that's an attribute. Or you may say, well, I'm very punctual, I'm never late. Or one could say, I'm a very forgiving person, a more moral attribute. Or one could be very honest and say specifically, well, you know, I get angry real easy and I fly off the handle and I might throw something and get mad at somebody and say something I shouldn't say. And so forth and so forth, we have characteristics like that. And we have attributes. But wait a minute, let's stop and ask ourselves a question. Did you know that God has also some of these characteristics too? For example, God is forgiving. We can be forgiving. God is punctual, always on time, not always maybe quick enough for us, but he always does what he needs to do when he needs to do it. Or God, for example, God does get angry just like we do. These are all characteristics that make you who you are. Some of them are inherent qualities that we share, or they are what we would call maybe temperaments or how a person is made up. But God's attributes are the characteristics of God that really make him who he is. God's attributes, though, are a little more complicated than just a definition because God has characteristics that are unique only to him. For example, characteristics that I do not share or you do not share. For example, we know God is omnipotent. He's all-powerful. There is nothing he cannot do. God is omniscient. He knows everything, even the possible outcome of every situation. God is omnipresent, which means he's everywhere. And God is a Trinity. Now, these are attributes of God that are unique only to God and God alone. Scholars are not really sure what to call God's attributes, so they break them up into categories, more for our benefit than certainly God's benefit. For example, some scholars break them up into 2 or 3 categories, depending on the particular scholar. The most common designations that you will see in theology books are, we would say, incommunicable attributes and communicable attributes. Others will break them down into the 3 categories. For example, communicable attributes, incommunicable attributes, and moral attributes. Incommunicable attributes are those qualities that are unique to God alone, or as Webster defines them, incapable of being communicated or imparted. In contrast, the other category is known by theologians as communicable attributes. Now, that's not a word that's really common in our vocabulary. Of course, neither is the word incommunicable. You probably never heard that word before I mention it. When I was a child, I used to hear the word communicable disease or diseases. Of course, as a child, I didn't know what that word meant until I heard it used by theologians here. And of course, it helps a little bit to know that a communicable disease was one transmitted among the community or shared among the community. It was a shared disease, a disease shared with others in the community. So it was transferable. So Webster defines communicable attribute as that which is capable of being transmitted or shared or able to be passed on from one person to the next. Now, this is helpful for us. It means that there are some attributes that we do share with God. Others will add a third category, as we've already pointed out, we call moral attributes of God. Now, some theologians have a different set of categories altogether, and they will call them different things. For example, very prominent theologian J.I. Packer, in his book, Knowing God, categorizes God's attributes as the Godhead of God, that's one, the powers of God, that's second, and then the perfections of God, three. Charles Ryrie, theologian, categorizes them as non-moral versus moral attributes, absolute and relative attributes, and communicable and incommunicable attributes. Packer's categories are very helpful. He has basically three, as we pointed out. The Godhead of God. Now, what Packer refers to, the Godhead of God, are attributes of God which set him apart from humans and distinguish him specifically from his creation. These attributes, such as his self-existence, his infinity, his eternality, his immutability, his Trinity and unity, etc., etc. For you see, we as humans do not share any of these qualities of God. For example, I'm not an eternal person. I'm not self-existent. I'm dependent upon other people to do things. I'm certainly not a Trinity. I do change, just like we all do. So I'm not immutable, but God is. He also has a second set of attributes, Packer, which he calls the powers of God. And these are attributes like God's omniscience, that he knows everything, his omnipresence, he's everywhere, he's sovereign, etc. Do we share any of these attributes? Well, some would argue, for example, like Charles Ryrie does, that they are shared to some degree with humans. For example, while we do not know all things like God, we're not omniscient, we do have a limited knowledge and intelligence. We can claim sovereignty over a limited space, certainly. God is sovereign. We can be. We can be present in a particular place like God, even though we cannot be everywhere at one time like God. We're not omnipresent in that regard. So we do carry some of those attributes to ourselves. And the third category, of course, of Packer's, he calls God's perfections, by which Packer means God's moral attributes, like his, for example, love, his holiness, his goodness, his mercy, his wrath, his faithfulness, etc., etc. Do we have any of these attributes like God? Well, to a limited degree, yes, we do. And I want to emphasize here the word limited. Now, we can love, we have that capability. We are commanded to do that. We love our friends, we love family, we love our spouses, we love our siblings. Do we love our enemies like God does? Well, certainly not, or usually not, even though we are commanded to do these things in the Bible. Does God get angry? Yes. The Bible says he gets angry with sin. He's angry with the wicked every day, the psalmist says. Do we get angry? Absolutely. And we usually sin when we get angry, unlike God. But you see, God's moral attributes are perfect. No faults or flaws like our attributes. So the point is, we do share to some extent these attributes with God. But only, again, I point out, in a limited way. And again, I emphasize the word limited. And this is why J.I. Packer sometimes has called these moral attributes of God God's perfections, and rightly so. Theologian Charles Ryrie has keenly observed that the communicable and moral attributes are shared to some extent in humans simply because mankind was made in the image of God. And that's a very good observation he's made. But to a large extent, the categories seem to be one man's opinion or classification. And even Charles Ryrie notes correctly that the categories may serve some purpose, but not much. The important thing is that the study of the perfections themselves are what we need to focus on, and not classifying them into one man's particular category. But of course, the one opinion that really matters the most, of course, is your professor's opinion, and this is, of course, at test time. So let's list a few of the incommunicable attributes of God, and we'll be listing more of these, the moral attributes, in our next segment. The attributes we do not share with God, and those that we'll focus on right now, are those that are distinctly His. So keep in mind, we do not share any of these attributes of God. For example, eternality. God is eternal. He had no beginning or end. Who made God, the child will always ask the parent. Well, no one made God. God has always been, and He always will be. He is the one who created everything, even us. That's hard for us to fathom. So God is the creator, I'm not. I do not share that attribute. Or what about God's self-existence? God owes no one for His existence. He's not dependent on any of His creatures for sustenance. I am. I have to have somebody to cook for me and feed me. But God is not. He does not depend on anyone. The name Jehovah implies that He is the self-existent one. And that was first found in the book of Exodus chapter 3 at the burning bush. So He's eternal. He's the self-existent one. He's the creator. And He's immutable. Another great characteristic of God. Immutability means that God does not change. His character is not dependent upon His mood swings for each particular day like ours may be. And God doesn't change with the shifting winds of popular opinion or political correctness like we do in our culture. God can always be depended on. He is immutable. What about Trinity and unity? Well, God is Trinity, one God, manifest in three persons, acting in unity. Israel's very foundation, Deuteronomy 6:4. Behold, the Lord our God is one. But we do know from the New Testament that God is a Trinity. There's the Father, the Son, and the Spirit. I'm not a Trinity. Now you say, well, wait a minute, don't you have three parts, Professor? We have body, soul, and spirit. Well, there's debate theologically, and we can discuss that as to whether the soul and spirit are different. So let's just say that might be questionable whether we're three parts. But some may want to argue that God's three parts or the Trinity, so therefore we're a Trinity. Not necessarily. We do know that God is spirit, and we know that we are flesh and we are spirit, and God is spirit. So therefore God is a Trinity. That doesn't mean we are a Trinity. But yet we see the holiness of God, okay? I'm not a Trinity. I'm not totally holy in the same way God is. Some even put God's holiness here because His holiness is intrinsic to who He is. It's not just one of His attributes, some have said. It is His very nature as God. There is no chance of God being anything but holy, and that's far from us. And what about God's sovereignty? God is sovereign over every situation. He's in complete control. And certainly nothing takes God by surprise. He is, after all, powerful, omnipotent, and there is nothing that God cannot do. Now, we cannot say the same thing about us. So these are just a few of God's attributes that are distinctly His. You're probably asking, if God is all of these things, and He is so distant and holy and sovereign, then how can we who are so lowly even approach such a God as this? If He's perfect in everything He does, then why would he have time for us? Well, let's go back to our very first segment. We told you there that God has taken the initiative for us to know him, and that hasn't changed at all in spite of who he is or his attributes. And we will try to answer these questions in our next segment, of course. But in our next segment, we're going to look at some of God's communicable attributes and his moral ones. And then we'll look at God's most unique attributes, of course, his holiness and his love.